It is Easter Sunday morning. The parking lot is full before the sun has finished rising. Inside, the church smells like lilies and coffee, and the particular kind of perfume that only comes out on Christmas and Easter. The choir is dressed in white. The bulletins say, "He is risen." And somewhere in the third row, a 7-year-old girl tugs her mother's sleeve and whispers a question that her mother cannot answer. She whispers, "Mom, where does it say that in the Bible?" Her mother smiles the way adults smile when they don't know something. The pastor smiles the same smile when the girl's mother asks him after the service. He says something about tradition. He says something about history. He changes the subject. But here is the thing. That little girl asked one of the most important questions in the history of Christianity, because the word Easter, that word, appears exactly once in the entire King James Bible. One time, in the book of Acts, chapter 12, verse 4. And when scholars went back to the original Greek text, they found something that stopped them cold. The word isn't Easter at all. It never was. Now, before you close this video and assume I'm about to tell you that Easter is a pagan holiday and Christians everywhere are wrong and the whole thing should be canceled, stay with me. Because the truth is far more interesting than that. The truth is that what the Bible actually says instead of Easter is something older, something richer, and something that ties the resurrection of Jesus Christ to a story that started 14 centuries before he was born. And before this video is over, we are going to talk about a Roman seal placed on a stone tomb in Jerusalem. We are going to talk about soldiers who were stationed at that tomb. Soldiers who, after a certain Sunday morning, went completely and permanently silent. We are going to find out why that silence is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the resurrection that most people have never thought about. But first, the word. Let's start with a man named Bede. Bede was a monk. He lived in northeastern England in the late 7th century, in a monastery perched on a cliff above the North Sea. He never traveled far. He probably never left the northeast of England his entire life. But he read everything. He wrote everything. And in AD 731, he produced a work called De Temporum Ratione, The Reckoning of Time, which became one of the most influential books in medieval Europe. In that book, Bede made a claim. He said that the English word for the spring celebration of Christ's resurrection came from a pagan goddess named Eostre, a Germanic goddess of spring and dawn, worshipped by the Anglo-Saxon people before Christianity arrived on their shores. Her festival was held in the 4th month of the Germanic calendar. When Christian missionaries brought the gospel to England, the celebration of the resurrection landed in the same season. The old name stuck to the new holiday, and the word Easter, according to Bede, was born. Here's what most people miss. No other ancient source confirms that Eostre ever existed. No Roman historian, no Germanic text, no altar, no temple, no coin with her face. The only evidence we have for this goddess is one paragraph written by one monk 1,300 years ago. Scholars have argued about it ever since. Some say Bede invented her entirely. Others say he was recording a genuine folk memory. We genuinely do not know. What we do know is this. The word the New Testament actually uses for the event Christians celebrate in spring is not Easter. It is not a Germanic goddess. It is not a Roman festival. The word is Pascha, and Pascha comes directly from the Hebrew word Pesach. Say that word quietly to yourself. Pesach. You have heard it before, even if you didn't know it. It is the Passover, the night in Exodus chapter 12 when the angel of death moved through Egypt and every household without the blood of a lamb on the doorframe lost its firstborn son. It is the night the Hebrew slaves packed their bags in the dark and waited. It is the night God said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." The Hebrew word Pesach means to pass over, to spare, to skip over in judgment because something has already died in your place. That is the word underneath Easter. Not a goddess, not a spring festival, a lamb, a door, a night of blood and fire and rescue. And now consider what Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 7. He doesn't write it as poetry. He doesn't write it as theology. He writes it as the most obvious thing in the world, the way you'd say water is wet or fire is hot. He writes, "Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed." One sentence. But if you understand what Passover meant to a Jewish family in the 1st century, the lamb selected 4 days before the feast, inspected for blemishes, kept in the house, killed at twilight on the 14th of Nisan. If you understand all of that, then Paul's sentence hits you like cold water. Jesus entered Jerusalem 4 days before Passover. He was inspected by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees, by Pilate, by Herod. Every authority in Jerusalem looked for a flaw and found none. Pilate said it 3 times, "I find no fault in him." And then at 3 in the afternoon on the 14th of Nisan, the exact hour the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple courts, Jesus died. That is not a coincidence. That is a calendar. A 1400-year-old calendar pointing at one afternoon in Jerusalem. So when you hear that the word Easter isn't really in the Bible, you are hearing something true. But you are not hearing the whole story, because the event Easter is trying to describe has been written into the architecture of Scripture since the night God told Moses to paint blood on a doorframe in Egypt. The word is borrowed. The story is ancient. And the story is only getting started. Now we go to the tomb. Not the painting of the tomb you have seen on church bulletins. Not the stained glass version with soft light and floating angels and everyone standing at a respectful distance looking peaceful. The real one. The one the gospel writers actually describe, with confusion and darkness, and a woman who has been crying so hard she doesn't recognize the man standing 3 feet in front of her. Her name is Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of John tells us she came to the tomb while it was still dark. That detail matters. She didn't wait for sunrise. She didn't wait for the other women. John says she came alone, in the dark before dawn, to a sealed tomb in a city where the men who killed Jesus were still in power. Whatever she was feeling, fear was not enough to stop her. She arrives, the stone is moved, the tomb is open and empty. She runs. She finds Peter and John, and she says the only thing she can think to say. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Notice she doesn't say he is risen. She says someone stole him. That is where her mind goes first. Grief does that. Grief makes the impossible seem more likely than the miraculous. Peter and John run. John outruns Peter. He actually tells us this, which is the kind of specific, slightly competitive detail that only an eyewitness includes. John arrives first but stops at the entrance. He looks in. He sees the linen burial cloths lying there. Then Peter arrives and goes straight inside, the way Peter always does, without stopping, without thinking, because Peter is Peter. And here is the detail that changed John's mind before he even spoke a word. The burial cloths were not scattered. They were not thrown aside the way you would throw a blanket off in the morning. They were lying there, and the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head was folded separately, set apart from the others, neatly, deliberately. John saw that, and John believed. Think about what that means. A body that was stolen would not have been unwrapped first. Grave robbers in the first century didn't stop to fold linens. The cloth was there because whoever left that tomb did not need it anymore. He walked out of it, or rather, he rose out of it, and he left the wrappings behind, the way you leave behind something you have permanently outgrown. But it gets stranger. Mary is still outside, weeping. Everyone else has gone home. She's alone again, at an empty tomb in the early morning, in a city that just executed the man she followed for 3 years. She looks into the tomb and sees 2 angels sitting where the body had been, one at the head, one at the feet. They ask her why she's crying. She tells them, "Someone has taken my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." She turns around. There is a man standing there. She assumes he is the gardener. She asks him if he moved the body. And then the man says one word. He says her name, Mary. And in that single syllable, everything breaks open. She knows that voice. She has heard that voice in crowds of thousands and in quiet rooms and across open water. She knows exactly who is standing in front of her. She grabs him, and the Greek word John uses suggests she is holding on with both hands and no intention of letting go. And Jesus says something remarkable. He says, "Do not hold on to me," not because he is a ghost, not because the resurrection was spiritual rather than physical, but because, as he explains, he has not yet ascended. There is still something that has to happen. There is a larger story still in motion, and she is standing at the beginning of it, not the end. She goes and tells the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Now, here is Thomas. Thomas is one of the most unfairly treated figures in the New Testament. We call him Doubting Thomas, as if doubt is the worst thing a person can bring to God. But look at what Thomas actually says when the other disciples tell him they have seen Jesus alive. He says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." That is not weakness. That is the statement of a man who loved Jesus enough to refuse a cheap imitation. Thomas is not willing to settle for a rumor. He's not willing to accept a story secondhand. He wants to know, really know, with his hands and his eyes, the way a carpenter knows wood or a fisherman knows water. He wants contact with the real thing or nothing at all. 8 days later, Jesus appears again. The doors are locked. He stands among them and he looks straight at Thomas and he says, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." We are never told whether Thomas actually touched him. What we are told is what Thomas said next. He said 2 words in Greek. 2 words that no Jewish person in the first century said lightly, because to say them about a human being was blasphemy. He said, "My Lord and my God." Thomas, the skeptic, the one who needed evidence, the one who would not settle for less than the real thing. Thomas became the first person in the New Testament to explicitly call Jesus God. And Jesus did not correct him. Pay attention to that. Now, we leave Jerusalem and travel about 15 years into the future. The year is approximately AD 54. The city is Corinth, a Roman port city, loud and commercial and morally complicated, sitting on the narrow strip of land between 2 seas. Paul is writing a letter to a church he planted there. And in chapter 15 of that letter, he makes a claim so bold, so specific, so legally structured that scholars have spent 2,000 years trying to figure out what to do with it. He writes, "I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Stop on that phrase, most of whom are still alive. Paul is not writing mythology. He is not writing poetry. He is writing something closer to a legal brief. He is saying 500 people saw this, and most of them are still walking around. Go ask them. Find them. Check my work. No one in the first century wrote that kind of sentence about a legend. You don't attach living eyewitnesses to a story you invented. You attach living eyewitnesses to a story you are confident can survive cross-examination. And this is where it gets remarkable. This letter, 1 Corinthians, was written roughly 20 years after the crucifixion. 20 years. In historical terms, that is nothing. Julius Caesar's assassination, for comparison, wasn't written about by Suetonius until 150 years after the event. The Gospel accounts of the resurrection are closer in time to the event than most ancient histories we consider reliable. But Paul's letter is even earlier than the Gospels, and most historians, including non-Christian historians, agree that the creed Paul quotes in chapter 15 is even older than the letter itself. The phrasing suggests Paul received this formula from someone else. Scholars date the creed he is quoting to within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion. Some date it earlier, 3 to 5 years, before myths solidify, before eyewitnesses die, before the story has time to grow. The Greek word Paul uses for resurrection is anastasis. It means literally to stand up again, not to float away, not to ascend spiritually while the body stays in the ground. To stand up again, the same body, transformed, physical, real enough to eat fish and be touched and cook breakfast on a beach in Galilee. This distinction matters enormously. The resurrection Paul is describing and the resurrection the Gospels describe is not a metaphor for the disciples finding courage after their leader died. It is not a symbol for the Spirit of Jesus living on in their hearts. It is a physical claim about a physical body in a physical tomb that was physically empty on a physical Sunday morning. And Paul is not the only person outside the inner circle of disciples who knew about it. Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing around AD 116, mentions in his annals that a man called Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and that the movement which briefly stopped after his death broke out again and spread even to Rome. Tacitus hated Christians. He called Christianity a destructive superstition. He was not trying to help their case, but he confirms the execution. He confirms the time period, and he confirms, with evident frustration, that the movement did not die with its founder. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the late 1st century, includes a passage in his Antiquities that references Jesus and mentions, in a form most scholars now consider at least partially authentic, that he appeared to his followers after his death. These are not friendly witnesses. These are Roman and Jewish sources, writing for audiences hostile to Christianity, confirming the basic framework of the story. The resurrection was not a rumor whispered in back rooms. It was a public claim, made loudly in the city where it happened, to people who could have walked to the tomb and proven it wrong. Nobody produced the body. Hold that thought. Go back to the Friday. The crucifixion is over. Jesus is dead, confirmed by the Roman soldiers assigned to the execution, men whose job it was to ensure the condemned did not survive. A Roman soldier drives a spear into his side. Water and blood pour out separately, which the Gospel of John records with the insistence of an eyewitness who needs you to understand he actually saw this. Jesus is dead. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Jewish council, a secret follower of Jesus who had not consented to the vote to execute him, goes to Pilate and asks for the body. This is a remarkable act of courage. Joseph is publicly aligning himself with a man the council just condemned. He takes the body. He wraps it in clean linen. He places it in his own tomb, newly cut from rock, never used. A large stone is rolled across the entrance. Now here is where the story gets legally significant. The chief priests and the Pharisees go to Pilate the next day, the Sabbath, which means they are breaking their own religious rules to do this. And they say something that tells you everything about how seriously they took the resurrection prediction. They say, "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said he would rise after 3 days. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people he has been raised from the dead." Pilate gives them a guard, Roman soldiers, and he says, "Go, make the tomb as secure as you can." They seal the stone with a Roman seal. You need to understand what that seal meant. A Roman seal was not a padlock. It was a cord stretched across the stone, pressed into clay or wax, stamped with the imperial mark. Breaking a Roman seal was not vandalism. It was a direct challenge to the authority of Rome. The penalty was death. Every soldier assigned to guard that seal understood that if anything happened to it, they were personally responsible. Roman military law on this point was not ambiguous. A soldier who fell asleep on guard duty, who deserted his post, who allowed a prisoner to escape, who was executed. These were not temple volunteers. These were professional soldiers with everything to lose. And on Sunday morning, the stone was moved. The seal was broken. The tomb was empty. Here's the part nobody tells you. Matthew records what happened next. The soldiers, some of them, went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. And the chief priests called a meeting. They gave the soldiers a large sum of money. And they said, "Tell people that his disciples came during the night and stole him away while you were sleeping." Read that carefully. The story the authorities invented requires the soldiers to admit they fell asleep on duty. In Rome, that admission was a death sentence. So the chief priests add a line. "If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." The soldiers took the money, and they told the story. Now, think about what that tells us. The enemies of Jesus, the people with every reason to produce a body, every reason to end the resurrection claim before it spread, did not say the resurrection didn't happen. They did not say the tomb was never empty. They invented a story to explain why the tomb was empty. And the story they invented required them to bribe soldiers into confessing a capital offense. They paid men to say they failed, because the alternative, the tomb is empty because he rose, was the one explanation they could not afford for anyone to believe. The soldiers took the money. And after that, silence. We never hear from them again. No soldier steps forward. No guard gives a deposition. No military report surfaces. No Roman official launches an investigation into the broken seal on an imperial tomb in an occupied city. The silence is absolute, and silence, in this case, is not nothing. A soldier who actually saw the disciples steal a body would have names. He would have faces. He would have a story the Romans could use. The disciples were not anonymous. They were known. They were being watched. Some of them would be arrested within weeks. If there were witnesses to a theft, the Romans had every reason to find them and use them. They did not, because there was nothing to find. That Roman seal on that borrowed tomb, the seal that was meant to end the story, became instead the fullest possible confirmation that the story was true. The authorities sealed the tomb because they believed Jesus might rise. When he did, they paid for silence because they had no other option. The guard went quiet. The tomb stayed empty, and within 50 days, Peter stood up in Jerusalem, the same city, in front of the same crowds, within walking distance of the same tomb, and told everyone who would listen that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. Nobody stopped him with a body, because there was no body to show. So let's go back to that little girl in the third row. She asked the right question, and now you have the answer. The word Easter is not in the Bible. She is correct. It appears once in one English translation from 1611, and even there it is a translation of a word that means Passover, a word pointing back to Egypt, to a lamb, to a door painted in blood, to a God who said, "I will pass over you because something has already died in your place." But here is what is in the Bible. The event is in the Bible. The empty tomb is in the Bible. The folded grave cloth is in the Bible. Mary weeping in the dark is in the Bible. Thomas reaching out his hands is in the Bible. 500 witnesses are in the Bible. A Roman seal on a borrowed tomb is in the Bible. Soldiers who took a bribe and went silent are in the Bible. Peter standing up 50 days later in Jerusalem with no body to contradict him. That is in the Bible. The word is borrowed. The event is bedrock. 3 things to take with you. First, the absence of the word Easter in the Bible is not a scandal. It is an invitation. It is an invitation to go deeper than the holiday, past the lilies and the bulletins, into the ancient story underneath. The story of Passover. The story of a lamb. The story of a God who has been rescuing people through substitution and blood and open doors since the night the angel passed over Egypt. Easter is not an interruption of that story. Easter is its final chapter. Second, the resurrection of Jesus is the most scrutinized, most contested, most legally examined claim in the history of religion, and the tomb is still empty. The enemies of Jesus had every resource, every motivation, and every authority to end the resurrection claim in its first week. They could not. They bribed soldiers instead. They invented stories that required men to confess capital offenses instead. 2,000 years of historians, skeptics, philosophers, and critics have attempted to explain the empty tomb without the resurrection. None of the explanations have held. The tomb is still empty. The body was never produced. The movement did not die. Third, and this is the one I want you to sit with, you do not need the word Easter. You need the empty tomb. Because if the tomb is empty, really empty, historically empty, irreversibly empty, then everything Jesus said about himself is true. The forgiveness is real. The promised resurrection of your own body is real. The story does not end with the stone rolled across the entrance. It ends with the stone rolled away. It ends with a folded cloth and a gardener who says your name. It ends with a locked room suddenly full of someone you thought you had lost forever. The little girl in the third row asked where it says Easter in the Bible. She is going to find out that the word isn't there. But she is also going to find something better than a word. She is going to find a morning, and that morning changed everything. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who has ever asked the same question that girl asked. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep look at what the Bible actually says beneath the surface. And leave a comment. I want to know. Did the answer surprise you?